Why did you come to RMC?
Quite a long story. But I guess the basic reason was that my mother's college roommate sent her son to RMC, a fellow named Jack Eaton, and he went through 4 years coming over quite often on Sunday afternoon to our house for tea, and he was a very, very fine guy, and I admired him immensely. So I thought if he was a typical RMC graduate, I couldn't do better than that. And 3 other young men in my block on Seward Street, Harold Davis, and all went to RMC. So going from my neighborhood was a natural thing. And then the big one was that when I was 15, I joined the 32nd Field Battery, which is Canadian Field Artillery, a horse-drawn 18-pounder battery reserve. And the officers were all RMC professors. So they more or less told us who were in the battery, the only way to get an education is to go to RMC. And a lot of us did. There were about 6 kids that were there when I was, that all went to the college. Oh, the fact that I was a fairly good football player probably overcame the fact that I was a lousy French speaker. But in those days, these things were tended to balance out. So that's why I went to RMC. Several of these guys were a year or 2 ahead of me, and I had a pretty good idea of what it was all about. There were no surprises to me. I remember feeling so sorry for a couple of my classmates who arrived at the college wearing hats, and they had to wear those hats all through till we were issued uniforms. So the ground was, "Don't, for God's sake, arrive at the college wearing a hat." That's a silly thing. There was a certain amount of shock, though, getting up early in the morning and having to polish buttons. And I guess I was lucky in drawing a senior, RCD Stewart, who was a very nice, decent fellow and didn't push me too hard. And if I railroaded his pants, he was forgiving. You've heard that from everybody, how we used to press our blues, didn't you?
We've always heard of putting them
we wet the seams, then put them under the bottom sheet. But I not only had to do my own, but do my seniors. And then it was a drop, who was a senior drop. So I had his pants as well, so I put a 2-inch thick pad of pants under me. But I got used to it. And we didn't have to polish our seniors' boots, though. That was considered demeaning to do somebody else's boots. You could do everything else for them practically, right, but not know. So we all did our own boots. And I was lucky enough to get into the middle flat of the Stone Frigate. The fact that I came from Kingston, knew a lot of the college staff, may have helped me out there, because I got a lakeside room looking over at Fort Henry.
With a view.
With a lot of cold air came in those slots, and we had no radiators in the room. There was an open transom above each door, and there were radiators, hot water radiators in the corridor. But at night, the rooms would get so cold that we had to keep a glass of water and a sponge to wet the seams of our blues for the pressing. And when you wake up in the morning, and that water would be either partially frozen or at least have a skim on it. So that showed we'd not only sleep with our blankets, but with our greatcoat and our cape on top of our beds as well in the cold weather. But it toughened us. It was a real Spartan treatment. That the guys that go there now are mollycoddled. We sort of sneer at the hotel atmosphere they have there now. And every morning, of course, you've heard this one on your own. Valley was at 6, and we had to immediately go in, dunk into a cold bath, and line up under the clock. And when the clock hit 6, we chant Reveille, Reveille, Reveille. And then we dash into the duty senior's room to report Webb. And he'd reach out and feel, usually 2 or 3, we'd push the ones who had actually got into the bath to the front. And it was just a blip on the screen. It only lasted 1 day. The big job was building all the obstacles. And in those days, military engineering was a feature of our instruction. So we all knew how to do lashings of, we had millions of poles, and we would build all sorts of walls and screens, and then all these tannery scrapings underneath that. You had to crawl under the tarp through. So you came out really stinking at the end of the obstacle course. And there was a log across a pit that was full of water with about an inch skim of oil and floating objects, which are hard to identify. And you had to dive into that, duck under the pole across the middle and go up the other side. You burned your clothes at the end of the obstacle race after the photograph. And then we had kind of a dance afterwards, and everybody had all this smeared grease in their hair, and their ears are full of grease. So a few of us who had girls who would come to the dance just couldn't believe themselves. My question most asked me was, "Could you get me a girl for the dance, Brit?" So a lot of them still don't speak to me, but there are a lot of Kingston girls that don't speak to me either. So
you had football. There was hockey as well.
Oh yes, we were, in those days, one of the ways to get into the college if you couldn't read or write was to be a really good hockey player. And as I mentioned, playing football helped to get me in over the French hurdle. But my roommate, Frank Peeble, who was killed in the Air Force, was a really good football or really good hockey player, but he was completely useless on the parade square. We used to beat West Point every year, but then they started bringing in people from Minnesota and western states where hockey was more popular.
Okay.
And boxing. We had boxing, compulsory boxing in first year. And I made the mistake of making the semifinal. Well, I guess I made the final in my first year. So I had to fight this guy, Herb Langdon, subsequent friend who was a TCS grad, and he was a really good boxer. And he knocked everybody else out in the preliminary bouts. He didn't knock me out, but he really gave me a hard time.
You couldn't go into a pub, of course, to get it.
No, we couldn't. No, but the senior class usually maintained a room, permanent room at the Frontenac Hotel, which they used as kind of a home from home. And they sold enough beer up through there. I don't think they ever charged for the room. And we couldn't carry parcels either, you know. I remember going into the liquor store one time before the Christmas dance and buying a Mickey orange gin. I had a piece of string. I tied the string around the bottle and hung it from my belt under my greatcoat.
So you did graduate, and then
it's a wonder, but I did. You know.
Yes, after 2 years, and then it was off. Well, by that time, off to war, training for.
Yes, up to Petawawa, and the fact that we were fairly well trained in military matters meant we didn't have to go through the usual officer schools that they were putting to reserve. A lot of the officers at Petawawa were reserve officers who had some basic knowledge of what they're doing. But we escaped all that, and were usually used as instructors. Actually, guns were in very short supply then. No, you didn't. I think there were 2 Bren guns in Canada. However, they did bring out a gun crew from Dieppe, guys who had come off Dieppe with a 25-pounder and supply of ammunition, and put on demonstration shoots for us. Laundry vans and things that were painted with khaki paint, but you could still see the Gilbert's Bakery and things like that painted through the khaki paint. And we were issued American Springfield rifles from the First World War. I graduated at the end of June,
and you were
went to Petawawa in July.
By December.
And we may have actually left there about the end of November, because we were shuffled around, spent a lot of time sitting on the troop ships waiting for convoys to. We got there just before Christmas. And about 2 nights later, somebody came dashing into the mess and said, "Come on out and see what you can see over London." And we all ran out. On the lawn, we could see enormous flames going hundreds of feet in the air. All the London dockyards were in flames. The Germans had dropped firebombs on all the oil tanks and the huge stores of lumber. but you could hardly get through the streets. The rubble was piled so high. So we ran into the same rubble thing in Caen. When we went through Caen, the streets were just piled high with rubble. The engineers came in, got a wide enough track through that we could get down to the engineers' bridge across at the racetrack.
Were you stuck in England from December 40 until D-Day?
Until after D-Day. Yeah. Well, we were all young. We had some learning experiences. We went up to Scotland quite often on leave, and it wasn't all that bad. London was quite an experience.
Training must have been, difficult.
It was difficult.
For such a long time,
but we got to be reasonably good. We had, with 4 years of training, our gunnery we prided ourselves on, and we would go down to Wales and shoot up in the mountains.
So what was it like, you leading up to in D-Day?
Well, my division landed at Dieppe. In fact, that's how I got to be promoted in 1942, and I was only 22 years old. There were 3 captains from 4th Field Regiment landed at Dieppe, and they were taken prisoner. And I got one of the vacancies, the troop commander. But in preparation for D-Day, we were having had our division land at Dieppe. The intelligence people thought the Germans would expect us, having had some experience, to be in the forefront in the first wave. So they put us down right at Dover as a threat against the Cap Grenade, which their whole plot was to make the Germans feel we were going to cross at the Straits of Dover. And there were all sorts of things to create that impression. But one of them was to waterproof the 2nd Division completely. And France was quite an eye-opener. The maps that we had, I was supposed to run, we were waterproof to land in quite deep water, but the landing craft that I went in could come in on a rising tide, and we drove off practically 3 or 4 inches of water. Of course, by this time the fighting was all several miles inland, except for the occasional shell from a German coastal battery that they'd swung around. The first gun position I took up was in the village of Buron, but the Germans in there had dug slit trenches, and these Hitler youth had dug a slit trench that was exactly 1.5 meters long and exactly 0.5 meter wide and exactly 1 meter deep. And there was a Schmeisser 42 there and 2 dead Germans. And this is the people we took over from at Étreville. The day before, the Brits had captured it for us. I think it was the Tyneside Battalion of the Glasgow Highlanders that had done it. And their dead were quite thick around there. But one of their mortar people had put a mortar bomb right down on the center of these two and killed both the gunners.
Came home early.
I got quite badly wounded the second attack on the village of Verrieres. So a little village called Verrieres, the Verrieres Ridge, mostly famous because of the terrible tragedy of the Black Watch from 1/2 mile over on the right. But the regiment I was with, the Hamilton Light Infantry, actually captured the village of Verrieres and held it. The other troop commander, Jack Thompson, when I hit the mine, one of my signalers, I think, my driver was killed, but my 2 signalers escaped unhurt, blown out but unhurt. One of them went over to the other carrier, Jack Thompson, and he came over to see me and helped to bandage me up and inject me with morphine. Each officer carried 2 little syrettes of morphine, which we were supposed to use only for our own people and not on prisoners. But that's the last time I saw Jack, because he was killed a couple hours later in the village. But he was concerned enough about the fact I'd been had a smashed leg, and I had a machine gun bullet in the neck.
Could you tell us about your military cross?
Well, I think we had a fairly difficult battle at this trophy farm. Again, we were up against these 15 Hitler Youth, but they were thickened up with the 272nd Division, which had a lot of foreigners in it, Poles and Czechs and conscripts of all the occupied things. I had the CO had given me the whole regiment. The other troop commander, Gordon Hunter, who was with, this is the Fuselage Memorial, he was with one company in Beauvoir Farm in the right, and I was in Trouville Farm on the left. We both took our objectives and took a lot of prisoners and inflicted quite a few casualties. But then we had to withstand counterattacks. And the German anti-tank people and some dug-in tanks had knocked out all of our support tanks except two, and all of our anti-tank guns as they were coming up. So we had no anti-tank guns to deploy in our defensive position. Then Gord Hunter got wounded, and his Beauvoir Farm was overrun. They had to surrender what were left of them. So the only part of 2nd Div, and the Essex and the South Saskatchewans on our right had been driven way back. And there we were, we didn't quite know that, but we were way the hell out in the blue. And
no flanks.
And no flanks and no anti-tank people. This little company of FMRs withstood about 4 counterattacks, very, very hard ones, over a two-day period, until they were finally down to 17 men. So it was, the FMR did very well there, and the gunners, my gunners back at the guns, were loading and firing almost as fast as they could. And one time we identified the location of a self-propelled anti-tank gun or tank, we weren't sure which, well camouflaged. He didn't fire again after we'd hammered him, so we were able to check most of the first counterattacks. And this is where I was firing the SOS with the German pistol. And do their players look the same as ours? And sure enough, they do. They're red, they're green, the same as our red and green. So I don't know why they gave me the military cross, but these infantry guys were kind of thin on the ground, and my guys, we had 1 Bren gun and 3 rifles, so we were able to add to the firepower. And we got big tins of what they call boiled sweets in our compo. So I thought these little French Canadian farm boys, who mostly had come in as replacements, the guys who lost at Dieppe, they were all scared green, and their first battle. So I wandered around the possession with 10 of these boiled sweets, and my rifle slung across over my back. Yeah. And gave me each a couple of candies, and they didn't have, no food was getting up. Tried to act as casual as possible, so I thought handing out candies might take their mind off their troubles, and I don't know whether you get an MC for handing out candies or not.
Right. So did you end up serving with a number of RMC graduates?
Yes. I was good point, Ed. I was adjutant of the 4th Field Regiment. I was a troop commander, and then I was made adjutant. And when I was adjutant, the CO, the 2IC, the 3 battery commanders, and me, and one of the battery captains were all RMC graduates.
That is, when I ask people from before the war, what prepared the most for battle, and you get one group talk about how RMC was critical to the whole thing.
Very much so.
And
I'm in that group.
Another group who say, no, it wasn't so much RMC, it's what happened after. But you would say RMC was.
I would say RMC,
very important.
Yeah, well, we learned an awful lot about teamwork at RMC. We learned that you don't abandon your friends, and the old truth, duty, valor thing may sound a little corny, but in those days it was a reasonable motto. And we still told the odd lie, but cheated the telephone company, but we still had the Valour.
Right.
And you sort of felt that more was expected of you as an ex-cadet than the ordinary civilian soldier who had joined the army for the war. You were a professional soldier, and you were expected to take the dirty end of the stick. So that's what prepared us, that